Future Sense is a podcast edited from the radio show of the same name, broadcast on Bay FM in Byron Bay, Australia at bayfm.org. Hosted by Nick Jeans and well-known international futurist Steve McDonald, Future Sense provides a fresh, deep analysis of global trends and emergent technologies. How can we identify the layers of growth, personally, socially, and globally? What are the signs missed, the truths being denied? Science, history, politics, psychology, ancient civilizations, alien contact, the new psychedelic revolution, cryptocurrency and other disruptive and distributed technologies, and much more. This is Future Sense. Yeah. One of the most beautiful pieces of music, I think, the Cello Suite No. 1 in G major from Johann Sebastian Bach. Playing that because of our theme today. We'll come back to that shortly. And you're now tuned to Future Sense here on Bay FM. It's 9:07. Thanks to Brett for another Bongo Gum. He'll be back on Thursday and Mondays and Thursdays, 6 to 9 a.m. And now you're with Future Sense, as I said, and myself, Nick Jeans, and my co-host, Steve McDonald. Good morning, Steve.
Good morning, Nick.
Lovely to see you this morning, bright and early.
And you?
Yes.
Absolutely.
And we have a special guest today.
We do. We've got our special guest, Ivory Root, who's visiting us from Houston, Texas. Welcome, Ivory.
Hi, thank you.
Nice to have you here. Beautiful. And first time in Australia too,
It is.
I understand.
Yeah, it is.
Are you enjoying it so far? How are the accents? Well, you know his accent anyway because you know him from over there when Steve's over in the US.
I'm used to rich, distinct accents, being from Texas, but it's beautiful.
I like that.
Very endearing.
Rich and distinct.
Mm-hmm.
So, and your history is interesting. We're going to tailor our theme somewhat around your work today because it's very relevant to what we talk about on this show.
We are, yeah. The theme for today is our growing grieving world. And Ivory is a hospice grief counsellor and death doula.
I am.
Yeah. And that's kind of why I'm playing this piece of music here, because I was listening to it yesterday knowing that Ivory was coming on and thinking like, this really in a sense has got all the grief and also the hope in a sense, or the faith inherent in it to me. And the cello being the instrument that actually has the richest set of overtones of any instrument, as I understand it. So in a way, it encompasses all of human emotions, from the joys to grief and everything else in between. So yeah, that was that piece of music there.
Hits the heartstrings, doesn't it?
It hits the
I think
heartstrings.
that's why it's used in film so often.
It is used in film so often. And I love J.S. Bach anyway. He's one of my favourites. J.S. actually started the well-tempered clavier, which completely changed music at the time because he managed to make the notes equal between each note, and it gave us the Western scale, which allowed for jazz to emerge, to put it really simply.
Bach, I think I've heard of him actually.
Worse than his Bart, for sure.
So, just a quick overview of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to look at healing and evolution, as we usually do on this show, as being on one spectrum of developmental growth. Really, both healing and evolution are about making ourselves more whole. So that's all connected. And here we are on the verge of, and really entering into now, this global paradigm shift as a human species, and we carry with us generational trauma from 2 world wars and many other smaller wars, of course, over the last century or two. Our personal traumas of many kinds, which we encounter in our personal daily lives. Global traumas, events which really sit apart from formal war. Things like 9/11, for example, that really did shock the world and even registered on the global consciousness studies instrumentation. Grief associated with the paradigm shift itself, leaving the old world behind and our old way of being and way of living, and moving on to something new. And I think that's something that is often not acknowledged or even seen, is that there is grief associated with going through a transformational change where you are leaving, you're really dying to something is dying, and you're grieving that and moving on to something else. And as we transition to this emerging layer of 6 consciousness, and in that process expanding our sensory perception and our capacity that's associated with that, we're moving through this phase of grieving for the whole of humanity, and some of us have already been through that and know what that's like, and a large number of people around the world are about to enter into that. So we're going to be facing mass grief. And how do we deal with that? How do we restructure our society as we're moving from this individual era, a lonely era of scientific industrial living, back to community, and we're remembering in the process how to live in community by looking back to the past, learning from our elders, in tribal civilizations and those sorts of things. And we need to not only just remember what we know from the past about rebuilding community, and in that process also dealing with grief as community, but also adding to it and evolving that process, so we're creating something new, something more complex, something more subtle and more capable in this new community that we're creating globally.
Beautiful.
A very rich conversation.
Good summary. Well, let's start with a piece. In fact, this is I've just really discovered Kate Tempest, but Ivory, you're familiar with her. I mean, I've come across her before, but I haven't really had to listen. And I came across this piece because in some ways she articulates in this very strong poem. So this is not, I don't think there's any strong language here, but it's a strong poem, really about the state of where we're at, and I think it articulates some of what Steve was just summarising there on that level. So we'll take a listen to this, and we'll be back, and we'll start talking about grief. And of course you can always text us in on 0437341119, 0437341119, straight to our computer screen here. If you have any comments or anything you'd like to add to our conversation, you're tuned to Future Sense here on Bay FM. It's 9:12.
You're tuned to Future Sense with Nick Jeans and Steve McDonald. Engage, emerge, activate, and spiral up.
Yes, you are, and it's 9:21 here on Future Sense, and thanks for joining us through till 11 o'clock this morning. And we're talking about, I guess, the grief of the world.
We are indeed, and we have our special guest, Ivory, from Houston, Texas, who is a grief counsellor. And Ivory, you and I met, I think it must have been 2015, at the premiere of the movie A New Understanding, which was a wonderful documentary that was produced by a mutual friend of ours, Robert Barnhart, about the psychedelic research in the US, which was giving terminally ill cancer patients a spiritual experience with psilocybin to address their anxiety around death. Yeah. And so I guess that was an interesting, in the context of today's discussion, that was an interesting connecting point for you and I, where that was all around grief and death and the anxiety and dealing with exactly. And so, just for the listeners' sake, give us a little bit of background. How did you get into this business as a grief counsellor?
Well, I left about 12 years ago, a very successful career in advertising, to go into hospice nursing assistant work as I was emerging into medicine, an interest in going into medicine, working in gerontology to try to focus on the future of our elders, very concerned about medicine around them. And their healing processes and the real goals, the holistic, direction I was hoping medicine would go in, and then suffered a very difficult personal trauma in the midst of that training, and that sort of pulled me right into the heart of the deepest grief, I suppose. My son was about 4.5, and we suddenly lost his father to a heart attack. A very healthy young 36-year-old man sort of dropped dead, and our whole world's changed very much from that. So I think through that personal grief and that connection with death, where I felt death sort of pass through me, and I realized, even though I was talking to it, asking it to not do this to my son, don't do this to me, don't do this to our family, it was a neutral power.
The notion of death passing through you, that's quite a beautiful, can you
talking to it,
enrich,
begging it, please, as if it was this this angel, something as if it was an entity, which is kind of how we, I think, relate to death, the Grim Reaper and all these other different sort of symbolism that we have around it, that it's something we can communicate with. It wasn't listening, it didn't have a voice, it didn't have a mind, it didn't have any malice, it wasn't there to hurt anyone. So I think that for me was extremely transformative, because I realized that there really is nothing to fear in that moment. To have that visceral experience is quite a gift. So I'm trying now, so I became a hospice, I went into social work, basically. So I did my undergraduate there, got licensed there, went straight into hospice as a social worker, and found myself leaving in one agency for a bereavement counselor, bereavement coordinator position. And so now I work on the bereavement side, and I've been a death doula for about 10, 12 years in addition to that. So I've helped quite a lot of people cross over and their families cope.
And the specialisation in grief, and particularly around death, I guess, where is that in terms of an established profession or a career? I mean, is there much in the way of like a body of knowledge and structure around educating people to do this work, or is it still sort of tacked on to the social worker?
Yeah, I was the only one in my graduating class that was interested in going into hospice, if that tells you anything.
Yeah,
I mean, everybody else was sort of focused on homeless veterans and, veteran issues or CPS, Child Protective Services, and, working with immigrant families and that sort of thing. So everybody had their passion. I was the only one that was interested in going into death and dying. So
right. So it's still an emerging field.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And why do you think that is? Because, and I guess in one sense in the West it's kind of obvious because we make death, we don't make friends with death. We make death a sort of dangerous stranger. It's interesting when you said death doesn't talk, death doesn't have an opinion, or however you said it before, it's great. And yet we have projected a whole set of qualities onto the notion of death, haven't we, particularly in the West, and avoided it terribly. So we don't talk to our children about it, generally speaking. We don't really talk about it until it comes upon us, and then it's this process which is almost stultified, stuck somehow, the dark, the black, the depressive, all these elements, which I guess come particularly from European heritage because it's not a sort of tribal way of doing things. So we've had this whole way of doing death in the West, at least for a long time, haven't we? And kind of have just denied its existence to a degree.
Well, we used to be born at home and die at home.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
And
things
then
changed.
Quite a bit.
Yeah.
Medicalised everything.
I think that death to the medical community is a problem. So we've treated it that way for some time, and there's a lot of honour in that because we are trying to bring a lot of healing to people too. So I have to give credit to those who have, sort of pushed the research, to go in the places it has, because we have extended life in a lot of beautiful ways.
Absolutely.
But there's great detriment to the fact that we don't see death as sort of this faithful companion that's with us from the moment of birth. We need to change and flip the script on death and see it as a faithful companion and not something that is here to destroy us.
So faithful companions are...
Reminds me of the Carlos Castaneda books.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
Right.
His teacher telling him that death was always walking behind his shoulder.
Yeah, true.
Just to be aware of that.
Yeah, I wrote that in a poem, I think, about Daniel, about his passing, about my late husband's passing, trying to make peace with it and give a language for my son.
Why faithful companion? Why faithful?
Never
How so?
leaves.
Right, do you get that, folks?
Never leaves.
Death is never far from you.
What's the highest fidelity,
Right.
other than the fact that life is terminal.
Okay. Oh, God. Death and taxes, folks. You tuned to Future Sense this morning and thought we'd talk about some incredibly positive things towards the future, how technology is saving us perhaps and all that. But no, we're talking about death. Yeah. Stick with it. Stay with it. And grief in particular, because that is the response.
Yeah, and death on all
A
scales
response.
here, from a very personal experience, as you've just described, Ivory, through to the death of the old paradigm, the death of the scientific industrial way of being, and moving beyond that and what that means for us.
Yeah.
Intuitively, I think we are pretty freaked out right now.
I think a lot of people are, and it's, I guess, as with death at a very personal level, a lot of it just comes down to a fear of the unknown. And crossing over, or, whether there is even a crossing over, or whether it's the end, and that's it, or whether it's a crossing over into something that we just don't really know.
And going back to just sort of the micro, if I may, giving you an example of how we've lost the relationship to death and dying, and the fear that we experience around it, being in someone's home where a person has, for instance, bed sores or something that are not going to heal. And so they have an odor to them that's unpleasant. And so we have tricks, where you'll put lots of coffee grounds, underneath the bed and that sort of thing. And it really frightens the families quite a bit, to say, well, why aren't you fixing this? Why aren't you healing it? It's very counterintuitive to them that people would have sores that aren't healing, but they don't want the decay in the home. And that's essentially what's happening. And that's a delicate word to use with someone.
Yeah, it's interesting that they don't want the decay in the home.
And that's all it is. That's really what it is.
Totally.
It's literally death and the decay of the body and the flesh.
So that speaks to the decay of all physical things and all living matter in a way, and how we avoid that, facing decay.
And there's an interesting interface between healing and death that I guess I really bumped to when I was working in emergency services, and I was responding to accidents and
Sure.
Witnessing sometimes people die in the course of a day's work, and the paradox, the challenge that the medical staff faced. I remember one particular incident where I transferred a patient to a country hospital in central Queensland. And as we were arriving there was an elderly man on a trolley in the hallway, actually, who had a cardiac arrest, and there was a few seconds where the doctor and a couple of nurses all looked at each other, and one of the nurses said, should we do something? And it's this point of, okay, do we just accept that this man is dying and that's okay, and we allow him to die, or should we, try and bring him back?
I have a lot of compassion for people in that role, for the ethical dilemma that they face in that moment.
Absolutely.
But they are they're hired to do a job, and that is to preserve life at all costs.
Yeah.
And in that sense, unfortunately, it's become, of course, an industry where figures and accounting of how many successful operations, how many people are lost or not lost, is rather important in the I guess the funding and the maintenance of the structure of hospitals and all of these kind of outlets here.
The hospice agency I'm currently working with just got a contract with one of our big hospital groups in Houston, Texas, medical mecca of the United States. And we're coming in now to do quote-unquote hospice, end-of-life care for people who are dying within 12 hours, 2 hours, 10 hours, 24 hours, because they have come in from some sort of, sudden, abrupt change in their health. And we're really just there. It's called virtual hospice is what they're calling it. We're really just there, even though it's a quite lucrative contract, to reduce the death quota.
Really?
To reduce the death rates for the hospitals.
Wow.
And I have, some personal, sort of moral injury occasionally with having to do hospice work for people that are not quite really hospice patients.
Yeah, I guess the flip side of that is that we are paying attention and putting energy into being with that process, rather than just leaving it to happen. Yeah,
that's the upside.
Yeah,
we are still we're giving them the comfort.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
For all of you out there, strangers in a strange land, you're grokking Future Sense here on Bay FM.
And we're back with Future Sense. Nick Jeans, me, Steve McDonald, and Ivory Root is visiting from Houston, Texas. We're talking about our growing, grieving world and the role of grief in present and future society and how that's changing with the evolution of humanity. And we're coming to the end now of the scientific industrial era, which has been over 300 years, so that's like over 10 generations of living in a very individually oriented way, and in a way that has, just by being itself, it has slowly deconstructed many of our community structures, and it's centralised us into cities. So our small communities have been degraded, and in the transition back to community, which has begun now, it's underway. We need to remember how to be in community, and part of that process is naturally thinking back to our tribal origins, back to the agricultural era also, which was community oriented, and try to remember, how do we live in community again? How did that go? What do we do? What do we have to do? And it's not necessarily about repeating what we did back then, although the themes spiral up and they continue, but it's about creating what's next, what's new. In how do we live in community in a more evolved and whole way than we ever have before, learning from the past in the process. And I'm just curious, Ivory, how that might have impacted the work that you're doing and your own learning.
Well, I think it starts with my very affectionate and loving family.
Yeah.
I think just having the compassion, that was taught to me, growing up in a very Christian family that where Christ was just love. There was nothing else. I could sit down and talk about my Buddhist fascination with my grandmother, and we just compared Dharma, to the gospel, which was really a very unique situation, I think, for me.
Absolutely.
And then later, I was very personally inspired by a teacher, a Guatemalan shaman named Martin Prechtel.
Martin Prechtel.
And he changed my life with a talk that he gave called Grief as Praise. And I really and truly base my practice now on that. I use those words to speak to the bereaved on a daily basis. I genuinely do. I tell them that we need to flip the script. Stop beating yourself up. Stop isolating yourself and calling this depression or hysteria. Why am I not crying? Let's focus on the fact that you and I can establish a sense of trust, which is what Martin talks about. He talks about the fact that we've lost the village. We've stopped trusting one another, and that's why we don't grieve out in the open. And he talks about weepers and how we needed to have weepers, and how in this village they'd have people who actually come down and would loosen the tears of those who could not come into their grief.
That's a lovely expression, loosen the tears.
Isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
I like that. And isn't it? It's interesting how we're in the process of sort of looking back and remembering how to be in community. We're learning so much from the communities, in the Americas, and of course, in other places around the world as well, where those traditions, those tribal traditions, have been continued through history.
Well, and even they had their facilitators, right? He talks about how they had their weepers.
Yeah.
So we have to have the facilitators, and we have to go to them.
Exactly.
We have to trust.
And when you were talking there, it also reminded me about the celebration of the Day of the Dead.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Which is also kind of flipping the script on the Western way, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which was what All Hallows actually
Yes.
is, in fact, isn't it? Of course, that celebration which we now know as the pumpkins. What's it called? Halloween. Yes.
That's it.
No one, can never really get it, but of course it goes back into tradition and into real stuff, and that is exactly what we're talking about here: the bereavement of, the acknowledgement of, the passing over of, of all of us eventually. When you're talking to, it's really interesting, both of you, because of course, when you talk about the last 300 years and being in the paradigm that we've been in Orange in terms of Claire Graves' work, the fifth layer, that individualization that we've experienced in this era, and the extremes we've gone to become individual, but in doing so we become incredibly lonely. And we've cut ourselves off from these deeper moments of community, and these deeper, especially when it comes, I guess, to death and birth, for that matter. Mm-hmm. Both ends of the scale have become, as we said earlier, hospitalised and medicalised and separate from, and sort of clean and sterile somehow, and removed from, all the nasty stuff that we might actually have to experience. And that rediscovery is really what's going on. And your work clearly is on one of those cutting edges of actually re-educating, in a sense, or reconnecting, as you said, remembering, with people. That's a huge thing, because so many people isolate themselves even further when it comes to grief, with these when death arrives in particular. I think people can tend to isolate themselves more, and yet because we have a tradition where you're supposed to come together for the family if someone dies, there's a kind of, at least there's some sort of moment there where actually people do come together, where they may not have for a long time, they may not have for any good deep reason for years perhaps, and yet someone dies in the family and they've kind of forced together, but there's a kind of uncomfortable nature to it, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes, and I'll talk to a lot of bereaved after the tide has gone out, we say. So everyone comes in and then the tide goes out, and we've got these people who are exhausted from the funeral. It's like, hey, give yourself a break. You actually just threw a really sad party.
Yeah.
All these relatives showed up. It is not Thanksgiving, Christmas time. Of course you're exhausted. You had to put your mask on, you had to mind your manners and not cry and not grieve openly. There were no weepers there, because if you have that, well, then everybody's quite worried about you.
So we have someone who's written in about Martin Prechtel, as you know, because in between you were going to talk about Martin anyway. You were going to talk exactly about this. And of course, as it happens, synchronicity occurs on this program all the time. Someone wrote in and wrote about this, and the best description he says, or she says, of grief and praise, look up Martin Prechtel, and that's Prechtel, Prechtel. He's also one of the great writers of our day, as well as a fully initiated curandero. We'll say, if you don't know what that is, we'll come back to that. Freely adapting from him, he says, the essence of grief's purpose is to feed the departed before they turn, without being able to look back. The food nourishes our conviction just enough to empower us to cross the vastness to the beach of stars, where the ancestors await with open arms. Quite beautiful.
Wow. Thank you for writing that in.
It's really nice. And that idea of feeding the departed, like if you think in a holistic way, that everything's connected, everything really is a part of us, and vice versa. In the process of losing the physical, there's a hole created there, and so we're feeding that through this process of feeding the bereaved.
And words are so important, obviously. So there's a lot of power in the word praise, where I am practicing. It's a largely, Christian faith-based.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
almost exclusively.
Yeah.
So the word praise doesn't make them uncomfortable at all.
Yes.
It's actually so soothing to them. I can't tell them that I got it from a Guatemalan shaman, but
which is what a curandero is. Correct? Come back to, we're going to come back to that just to explain.
But so that's a word that's very soothing for a person of any age. You know?
Yeah, and it also speaks very much to the importance of customizing language and processes to the culture that you're working in. Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Very important.
And obviously that works very well there. Might not work so well in a place that didn't have a Christian foundation, perhaps.
And a lot of your focus is on a universal language, right?
Yes, yeah.
But we've got a lot of work to do in communities, and families, in terms of reaching them on a micro level to find words to connect us that are specific to the region before we can, really get into that universal language. So there's a barrier there that we'll work through.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And it's about, I think it's about learning to pay attention to these differences, like cultural differences and those sorts of things, and having the capacity, the skills, the resources to be able to adapt when we need to, to meet people where they're at. And that's very much a key part of Claire Graves' work, is understanding that people aren't all at the same place. People are essentially operating on different frequencies, and the best we can do is to meet them where they're at and give them what they need in their own language and their own style.
Yep.
Yeah.
Another text has come in, which is kind of relevant just to what you were saying there. Personal experience here. My stepfather passed over 3 years ago. My dad passed over a couple of years ago, and have many, many friends pass over the past decade. These multiple numbers of deaths have smashed my sometimes illogical mind. I feel pain when I see people hurting from their loved ones passing over. My losses to me are huge to me, and I talk to them wherever my past loved ones are and feel them sometimes communicating back to me. I find this communication healing for me. This subject is so wide and varied, having many avenues of understanding or attempting to understand. Why has no reason why. You can really feel the pain and the honesty and depth of experience there from this person. Thank you, whoever you are, male or female, because, beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. And it reminds me of the nested nature of our own development and of human development generally, where we start, we're born into essentially a pre-rational reality where we're operating from our urges and instincts and our basic needs. Everything's very much in the moment, and we seek to, resolve, solve, feed, whatever it is that's arising right now. And then from there we transition into the dominance of the rational mind, where everything becomes very rational, and we've just kind of reached a peak of that in the scientific industrial era. And within the first tier of the layers of consciousness, we tend to we're essentially flipping backwards and forwards from left and right brain dominance as we go through there. So every time we've transitioned to a new layer, we're kind of kicking out the baby with the bathwater and flipping back to communal or individual, whatever it might be. And so I think part of the difficulty that we have generally around grief in society at the end of this scientific industrial era is the rational mind has been in charge, and we've tried to just handle it all with the rational mind, when it needs to be a whole body, whole system experience, right? Grief, and it needs to speak to and through our pre-rational selves and our trans-rational selves if we have access to that also.
Yeah, and of course, as you're speaking, I'm also thinking, of course, of the macro and the fact that the new grief that is arising, the grief about the planet, for example, the global grief that now we can experience because we have that overview of all of us being on this one being, this planet, this Gaia, if you will. And we also have, I think, a lot of grief about anything passing away. We've built such huge institutions which have governed us somewhat well for a long time. It's created a lot of advancements. We've solved a lot of the Earth's problems in the last couple of hundred years, and certainly in the last 100 with our technology, with our advancements, a lot of people out of poverty and so forth. And yet now those institutions are clearly past their use-by date. Yeah. And we're grieving. We still don't want to let those go. And there's an interesting piece in the Guardian yesterday, Guardian Australia, from Clive Hamilton, well-known Australian writer, talking, and I've got it over there, but very loosely, about the loss of culture, that the people are now voting not about policies. It's also true in America. He hypothesized about Trump's win, and also in Brexit. It's not about politics or even economics. It's about culture. It's about, I don't want to lose my culture, my way of seeing things, my approach to stuff. So I'll vote there, even if it's not going to be beneficial for me economically. It's easy for me to stay in the known.
Yeah.
But that goes back to our relationship to our ancestors. So if we're trying to honor the fact that our grandparents or our parents were Republican in America.
Yes.
Okay, so that's what we grew up with. That's our culture.
Yeah.
And so why would we change our vote? We can't change our party. We're betraying, our own personal culture, even if it goes against everything, that we see is right for the future. We cannot go into that booth and betray our ancestors.
Yes.
So that's really tricky in America, I think. There's a lot of resentment, amongst, even within families. Like, how could you continue to vote this way?
Yeah, absolutely. And it also speaks to the fact that as we're in this transition phase, the natural tendency is to regress back to old values, because we've come to the end of the use-by date, as you said, Nick, of the scientific industrial values. They clearly don't work anymore, and we can't see into the future. So the human instinct is to look back. We'll go, okay, how were things back then? Maybe we should go back to that. And this is also part of remembering from our past experiences as we move into new community. So it's quite natural that people, they're thinking more traditionally and going back, what did my grandparents do? Maybe everything was okay back then. Maybe I should just, go back to living like they did. And those sorts of things.
We also have been dumbed down and we don't really know our history.
Yeah, that's true. That's very, very true. Yeah,
we're not being taught proper history.
Yeah, and the whole, the values aggression itself is a dumbing down, and but it's a very natural process of the death of of our old culture, because what it does is it builds the evolutionary tension by going back to simpler values. They're even less appropriate than the ones that we're just leaving behind. And so it's like pulling back that elastic band on the slingshot and creating the potential energy for the big shift that's coming.
Well, I suppose in that way, all the destructive fallout that comes from these sorts of political climate, maybe that is
absolutely, yeah. It's all. I sort of come from the angle that everything's perfect, everything's part of a natural process, and often we can't see that, we don't understand it, so we say, oh, it's wrong or it's bad. But actually, if you look deeply enough, it's all natural. And even, like the death of the US empire, which seems to be underway at the moment, and Trump's role in dismembering this, I almost said beast then, but it's all part of a natural process, and it's essential for change to happen. Using the analogy of like a kid's, say a kid builds a ship out of Lego blocks. You put all the blocks together, you have the ship. If you want to change it into an airplane, you can't just snap your fingers and do that. You've got to pull it apart. The system of blocks has got to come apart. So
and the kid goes, no.
Exactly. And you go, hang on a minute, it's okay. Just hold it. We'll we're going to make an airplane. It's all right.
Yeah.
And God, that's an analogy for the whole global shift at the moment. Is things are coming apart. Everybody's looking at it, going, oh my God, no, we're losing everything. It's just going to be a pile of blocks, and we'll all.
And it's interesting with the article that I mentioned by Clive Hamilton referring to this, and it's slightly tangential, but not really, because he says the argument that money doesn't buy happiness is typically attributed to the comfortable middle classes, but it can apply at the other end too. At the lower end, those who vote against their economic interests might be worse off under a conservative government, but they will feel better because of the psychic wages they receive from knowing their anxieties are being recognised and addressed. These psychic wages compensate for any decline in material living standards. Isn't that the case in our countries now? That so many people will just vote down that line just to keep their psychic space intact back in the past, where they were comfortable, and projecting this is the way it should be in the future, otherwise I can't survive, and yet everything's collapsing as we speak.
Maddening in America.
Well,
really.
it's not. We're not far behind here. Believe me.
So the psychic wages is actually political spin. Is that what it is? Fake news.
Well,
make us feel good.
I think I think exactly that. I think it's a marketing ploy in a sense. Absolutely. And as we know, the Americans invented marketing. Basically, did a great job of it. It's done a really good job of selling the world on all sorts of things.
Hey, I left the industry. All right.
I've learned from it, I'm sure.
I forgot you're in advertising.
You've been listening to Future Sense, a podcast edited from the radio show of the same name, broadcast on Bay FM in Byron Bay, Australia, at bayfm.org. Future Sense is available on iTunes and SoundCloud. The future is here now. It's just not evenly distributed.